Hello, and many thanks for joining us. I'm Felicity Ezewuike. Last week, we made an attempt to review our pursuit of justice for human rights violations. We talked about where we are at and what we can do to improve justice and how this impacts on the continent's development. Today, we're still talking about human rights, but the focus is on those who fight for justice. How are we protecting the defenders of human rights? Here is why this conversation is important. 1,940 killings and 106 enforced disappearances of human rights activists, including 4 journalists and trade unionists across 81 countries, were recorded between 2015 and 2019. In 2020, 331 people seeking to promote human rights were killed across 32 countries. This data is from the United Nations. In 2021, frontline defenders recorded at least 358 murders of human rights activists globally. Advocates say the figures are most likely far higher than it's being reported. Now, in addition to threats to their lives and enforced disappearances, they regularly face detention, surveillance, criminalization, and other grave risks as a result of and with the aim of hindering their work. Today, we will explore what framework exists for their protection, how it is being used, and more ways, if any, to better ensure that human rights defenders everywhere are able to freely and safely undertake their vital work. My guest is a human rights advocate, a gender equality expert, governance specialist, and civic leader with more than 17 years' experience leading teams at international and non-governmental organizations, civil society networks, and policy research consulting firms. She is currently the director of Amnesty International Nigeria. Many thanks for joining us, Osai Ojigho. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone.
We accept anyone. Good evening to you. Let's begin with a deeper understanding as to why is it important that human rights activists or defenders, I think we'll stay with the defenders, so vital?
Well, like your intro said, they play a critical role in ensuring that the rights of people are protected. They tend to be in the forefront of campaigning for justice, campaigning for positive change in the lives of individuals and communities. And oftentimes they do this at extreme personal costs and at great risks to their lives because they are challenging oppressive governments, or they are putting themselves in the front line of agitations on issues that have diverse interests. So oftentimes it's for the good of humanity and for nothing else. And this is why it's important that human rights defenders are protected, because they're like also the conscience of the nation. And this is a group of people that the United Nations, the African Union, relevant international bodies recognize as playing a key role in our civic space and in holding governments and leaders to account.
You mentioned government, and when we think about persecution, the first thing that comes to most people's mind is established authorities. But we know they're not the only ones. Who else is in this group of persecutors of those that defend human rights?
One other group are large corporate organizations, specifically multinationals, but corporations in general, because oftentimes they are dealing with natural resources or products that are linked to communities, and they are focused on profit making. So if you have someone saying, for example, you cannot mine in this area because it's going to affect the water of the community, the corporations see the person or the group of people who are campaigning against their activities as troublemakers, and therefore look for ways through which to remove them or to, ensure that they are slammed with some criminal offense. Or in extreme cases, they disappear, as we've seen happen a lot in Latin America and also in parts of Africa, like the DRC, Nigeria also, where there are heavy investments in mining, natural resources like gold, like cobalt, and even trees. Environmental activists, in fact, are the ones that have been discovered to be most at risk because they are charged, they tend to disappear. And sometimes, like happened to Beta some years ago, were found killed in their communities because these are huge resources for these corporations, and they want to be able to take those resources with very little resistance or at very little cost to the communities who live there.
Let me go back to the interest, those figures I mentioned. There are advocates who are saying that it's been underreported. Do you believe that the figures that's being presented by UN and some other bodies, including yours, represent the true number of rights activists that are being persecuted and murdered across the globe?
Oh, our numbers are just the barest minimum, to be honest, because these are numbers that we have been able to identify independently. So they're information that you can't verify. You know, you have a sense based on the information you've given that it could have happened, but you've not been able to independently verify it. So you can't put those numbers out there. Then there are those cases that we never hear about. You know, we hear about the big cases, or we hear about people who are in media or in the public space, or people in villages somewhere, in remote communities, or even people who left home and never came back. Sometimes you're not able to link it to their work or their advocacy, and so you cannot say 100% that this person was targeted or is missing or was killed as a result of their work. So the numbers that are out there are just, you know, we should anticipate that the numbers should be much higher if we're able to fully document and follow through all of the cases that we receive.
Yeah, I needed to bring that question up because you keep seeing figures and you keep seeing people saying that that is not a true representation. And for people to truly understand the importance of this conversation, we need to know that there are people that we don't even know are missing, but they are missing. So back to the conversation about the question of those who are persecuting human rights activists. There is also the submission that the same things that slow down the wheel of justice for these defenders that seek justice for other human rights violations are the same things that are affecting and persecuting these defenders in terms of our judicial system, the lack of structure, a weak institution, and especially a lack of independent judiciary. I want you to explain this in context for those who might not really understand.
So in the first instance, if things worked, you wouldn't need NGOs or human rights defenders or activists, right? So they arise as a result of the gap in provision of social services, as a result of abuses and violations that exist in their communities or areas of focus. So if the system is already struggling to provide a service and to protect people, then when you come to the same system to ask for help, there will be challenges. And that is why the laws have been designed in a way to raise this issue at an international level, at a level that goes just beyond the national level. So a human rights defender is trailed by an operative that is unhappy that if it's a journalist, for example, has written a story exposing or asking questions about corruption, for example, and reports to the same police that are supposed to be protecting this state operative. There's a tendency for them to be biased because they feel they're protecting the interest of their benefactor. But if the issue is put on the table at a global stage, you find that they are very careful about how they handle those cases. So yes, to some extent, the fact that we have a system that is slow means that it gives a lot of room for those in power to abuse their authority if they get hold of a human rights defender that they feel is providing information they don't want the public or other people to know. On the other hand, because human rights defenders are pushing the system to do the right thing, and they know that they are getting international attention, whether at the level of the regional bodies or the UN, the authorities are more careful about how they respond to those cases because they know that someone else is going to monitor and someone else is going to ask questions about it. So in a way, it also helps, amplify the voices of people whose rights have been violated and offers some sort of protection to the human rights defender.
Okay, I want you to speak on, aside from some of the things we've mentioned, are there particular or say special concerns about the protection of human rights defenders? Are there things that jumps out to you particularly that you think maybe the world should pay better attention to?
Definitely, because of the threats and the harms that human rights defenders and activists are exposed to, even there's a declaration on human rights defenders to provide some sort of guidance to countries and governments. But the biggest risk human rights defenders that we face is personal security, personal safety and security. If you are doing this work, there'll be people that are upset about it. They could try to harm you verbally, psychologically, physically harm you, show some sort of force in order to discourage, intimidate, and prevent you from carrying out your investigation or for reporting a case or participating in an investigative process, so many things like that, or to discourage you from picking up a case. So assuming you work with women in shelters, and you're helping women who are victims of domestic violence. If their partners or family members begin to threaten you on the phone, begin to trail you to your workplace, make a scene at the shelter, it might make you feel like, okay, this case is so problematic, perhaps I don't need to get involved. The other area is emerging more now, especially with digital technologies, is surveillance. So you find that even your privacy as a human rights defender, so you're doing your work and you're doing your advocacy, but then there's invasion of your family life. People have planted bugs on your phone. People are tracking you. People are following you in order to survey you and in order to make sure they can, guess your next move so that they can either put obstacles or prevent you from getting the information you need. And this particularly brings other possible violations for the human rights defender beyond even privacy, because then your information can be exploited, you can be implicated on matters that you know nothing about because people are able to manipulate your information for their benefit. And then finally, the fact that all over the world, a lot of trials, so it's not just in Nigeria, but a lot of investigations into wrongdoings committed tend to take too long. There's a tendency for people to even forget why they were on the case in the first place. And it creates this impression that people have to be extra cautious about speaking out even when it's the truth, because the truth could literally get you killed. And this is something that is now operating in the minds and at the back of the head of many human rights defenders, that how can we do this work safely and securely? And this is where the Human Rights Defenders Declaration comes to play, because it upholds the rights of human rights defenders and also the fact that they play a key role in governance. And government shouldn't, just dismiss this with a wave of a hand, but rather to encourage human rights defenders to come out and share their concerns without reprisals.
Okay, you've referenced the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders. This is a UN mandate, declaration rather, that promotes and protects human rights defenders. And we know it was committed to around 1998, I believe. I want you to talk about this particular instrument. Just How impactful has it been? Because it's an issue that everybody's concerned about, including the UN. So they came up with this. So for somebody who is not aware of this instrument, explain it and then tell us how impactful you believe it has been for us.
So the impact mostly has been in terms of providing a safety net for human rights defenders. It's something that you can always refer to as a guide for governments, because they often will say, oh, we don't know what to do, or we don't know who human rights defenders are. So the definitions are clear in terms of people who defend rights. And oftentimes these are rights that are not necessarily theirs. So they might not be directly involved in the rights that is being enjoyed. The second thing is that it provides a legal framework that states can make to create a law at local level that makes the declaration and the protection for defenders enforceable directly. This has been the major challenge that we have, because a lot of countries, it's very easy for them to sign and adopt treaties at international level, but then bringing it down to earth in the countries where they live is a bit of a challenge, and this makes it even difficult to enforce. Even though international law says you cannot dismiss as irrelevant treaties you've signed, the practicalities require laws, policies, procedures to be laid down clearly in terms of how people like human rights defenders should be treated. The other thing again is the recourse human rights defenders have to complaint mechanisms. So there are complaint mechanisms at the UN. There's experts whose job basically is to document and report on this. And this is quite useful because it provides a tool through which this special rapporteur on human rights defenders, for example, or UN experts on freedom of expression or freedom of assembly can then intervene in a matter at national level. Without such a declaration, there will be no sort of basis for them to intervene more specifically to attend to the needs and the protection of human rights defenders. It would just have been like every other person. Okay. And that would not be fair, because putting yourself out there means that you're taking on risks, and then this risk needs to be mitigated. And finally, the declaration calls for a safe environment for human rights defenders to work and to thrive in. This is very basic, but many countries all over the world still struggle with it, because as long as people are harassed for expressing an opinion, especially when it's a dissenting opinion, then the environment is not conducive for learning, it's not conducive for understanding potentially alternative views to addressing some of the challenges and issues that come our way.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to speak on the work that the UN Special Rapporteur does and the impact it has had. You've already highlighted some of the challenges, but before that, I'd like you to talk about the adoption of this UN declaration at the state level. What is the level of adoption at the state, and is it impacting at the national, the country level, basically?
So oftentimes these treaties and conventions, and in this case declarations, are drafted by state parties themselves. That's the interesting thing. It's not civil society that draft and gives it to them. Of course, civil society are involved in the process. They can advocate and say, oh, we think you need this document, right? But it is a document that is an agreement between states. So that's the first thing we need to clarify. And so it's states that will present it at their sessions and say, okay, do you have any comments, questions on any of the elements that have been provided in this document? And then they adopt it through voting in their sessions. So, but the challenge we find is that, you adopt in your sessions, but then you come back home and don't talk anything and don't say anything about it. And that's where civil society comes back to say, we're going to continue reminding the public.
You made this decision, so you have to implement it.
You have to implement it.
Yeah.
And a law is often one way of doing that. The other way is to put policies and procedures in place. So for example, if the police, if you're at the station and you come and you say, I'm a human rights defender, this is what I do, you have people arrested, I want to see them, I want to see if I can get legal assistance to them, or you should have done this, you should have done that. The police would automatically know, if they've been trained, if the principles have been mainstreamed, that these are people that are offering voluntary service to the country. And so you should accord them respect. You should treat them with dignity. Okay. But nobody is instilling these principles and policies within the training modules and continuous assessment for security agents, for government officials, even people in ministries. How many people are aware of a lot of these issues? They just see activists as people who just make their life difficult, and they can't wait to get rid of them.
That's quite sad. Quickly, before we go on a break, I wanted to speak on the work that the UN Special Rapporteur does. How aware are people, defenders, human rights defenders, of the work that the UN Rapporteur does, and is it impactful? You talked about the challenge of them getting involved in national issues.
Yes. So there are various expert bodies within the UN and even special mechanisms that people can write an email to. In the past, it used to be letters. Now you can just send an email, and the information are very readily available on the UN site and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And if you don't even want to go as far as the UN, at the African Union level, at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, we also have a special rapporteur dealing with the issues of human rights defenders in Africa. And they can write letters, they can raise issues of concerns with state parties, they can follow up, they can request for missions so that they can do visits in country. They can also do urgent appeals when there's a case of maybe someone who is at risk of being arrested or detained or deported or harmed in any way. And it helps because it brings global attention to the issue. And the sad thing is because there are not so many cases they can take on, because they also have their processes through which they need to verify and check that it's a genuine case that they can add their voice to. And more importantly, they can reach and follow up with the country concerned. But they do a lot of this work with the support of staff within the UN allocated to help them in documenting and reporting on these issues. Okay. We know that urgent appeals from special rapporteurs work, because at the very least, they prevent those who are holding human rights defenders from committing further harm on them, at the very least. And at the best, they are released, they are restored to their status, or back, allowed to go home and allowed to be able to do their work.
I think this is a good point to go on a break. There are concerns that government, Osai actually mentioned that there are concerns. These governments are failing in their moral and legal obligations to prevent the killings of and persecution of human rights defenders. When we return from this break, we'll explore the role of state actors and the nagging lack of political will. Stay with us. Glad to know you're still with us. Let's talk state actors now. Their commitment is set out already in the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders earlier mentioned. What's your assessment of their execution of the responsibilities contained there? We tend to see them as the #1 persecutors of defenders.
Yes.
So
in the first instance, a law would have been good to have in all these countries, but we know Nigeria doesn't have a law for human rights defenders, and several countries too. And so that was already a big oversight. And that is why it makes it easy for lots of the actions they commit against human rights defenders not to be captured within the law. but rather you have to use other means, the criminal law, penal code, civil provisions in order to protect the rights of human rights defenders. But even at that, the constitutionally protected rights were re-emphasized in the declaration. So the rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and the lot. The other thing is that states have a duty to ensure that everyone's rights are respected, regardless of their status. I think that principle of non-discrimination and equality before the law is really important. And this is something we've really struggled with, particularly in global South countries, so countries in Latin America, Asia, Africa, in the fact that when you are in power, when you have an office holder, your duty first and foremost is to protect the institution and the law. So even if something annoys you, you cannot use the mechanism of your office to oppress, intimidate, and punish people. There's a reason why equality before the law is a principle that is respected all over. So one way states can actually improve action is by seeing human rights defenders as equal to political actors, equal to corporations, equal to every entity that is being represented in the country. And I think that aspect of treating people with respect would change. The other is to take the cases seriously. When you come and report that someone is missing and they find it's an activist, the amount of attention they put into ensuring they get to the root of it needs to be heightened, because this person, removing this person or persons means that a group of people, communities, the issues they are addressing can, if not properly managed, go away, die with them as well. So it's critical that they take complaints about acts that have been committed against human rights defenders seriously, which they do not necessarily do so now. And then the final point I'll make on this is the fact that the state needs to see that the people that have elected them, together with human rights defenders, are all on the same team. They are here to improve the country, the community, and so they should be seen as partners for progress. I think that would make a major shift in terms of how states also handle and respond to human rights defenders.
I think it would be fair for us to talk about your domain for a bit. What would you describe as some of the missed opportunities that could have been used to strengthen the commitment of the country to the protection of human rights defenders?
So the first thing would have been to have a simple law applicable at federal level and at state level on human rights defenders, just to say their rights should be protected. These are what human rights defenders do. Another would be in the involvement of policy. A lot of the time when governments draft policies, they do that within ministries and state organs and agencies. There's a provision, or it's encouraged, that they should involve civil society in these conversations. They can create a space for human rights defenders to participate by sharing information timely, so people know that these policies are under consideration and that they are willing and open to receive advice, documents, memorandum on this issue. So it's not only when a law is being passed and we're engaging with the National Assembly, but when policies are being developed, they should be, they have National Orientation Agency, they have the broadcasting commissions, advertise in newspapers, announce in radio, oh, we're going through this review. We would have it town hall meetings in certain localities. We would give some space for human rights defenders, activists, community leaders to participate in those spaces so that they can get feedback from the beginning. It's not after they've designed the plan, and then people are now raising issues with it. And that's okay, well, it's done. There's nothing more we can do about it. Another thing also is there are quite a number of resources that have been developed and written by human rights defenders. These are in annual reports. These are also in research analysis that have been done on specific issues. It would be an important service that the state can do in following up with activists on these issues and seeking further information. Oftentimes, there's a tendency to dismiss or to ignore, but rather than look at the recommendations that have been proffered in those documents. Another, if we can try and stretch it a bit, is that before issues become, escalated, human rights defenders usually would have been sending warning signs. They would have been saying, oh, we know this community is under threat. Oh, we know these issues are happening. They serve as an early warning mechanism. Oftentimes, they are labeled as doomsayers, and so they're not taken much seriously. Then when the situation escalates, then it becomes even more tiresome because you've been raising these issues, they've been ignored, and now we're all in a reactive mode.
Everything you've said so far, sorry to interject, but everything you've said so far, what we need to do, it all sounds good, but it all still hinges on political will, isn't it?
Political will seems to be the blanket statement when things are not working well. And I also appreciate it because you say, oh, the laws are fantastic, the policies are there, we have the institutions. So it's because of lack of political will and all of that. But I also believe it's about commitment, more so. We've seen the power of the people and the power of movement because even the communities themselves sometimes are unaware and unappreciative of the contributions of human rights defenders. Can you imagine if a human rights defender is arrested and everybody in that community goes before the police station and insists they be released? The police will be like, hey, what is going on here? This is somebody that we need to tread carefully about. Oftentimes as people, we have, we've outsourced our obligations to others, and we feel it's the responsibility of the human rights defender to deal with all our issues. And when they need our help, or when we need their help, they're hesitant or they're unsure. The power of the people, we've seen it in the movement. So whether it's EndSARS, whether it's Black Lives Matter. And so I believe there's also an obligation on the part of the people, on the part of citizens, on the part of the community.
If I may be like a clog in the wheel here, you talked about the will of the people. Everybody was roused when we had the EndSARS protest, and a lot of persons were hoping that this will spell change. Your report for 2021 states that some of the people who participated in that protest were held behind bars detained for months, almost a year plus. And then the EndSARS has happened and it has gone. The people spoke, but the same you said is a word we use to try to make a blanket statement when things are not working, but it still goes down to it. All the noise, all the comments, all the alleged commitment that reforms will happen after that protest doesn't seem to have made a lot of impact. So, again, political will. Who would bail the cart? Who would push? Because civil society push, the people push, the leaders refuse to do. Where does that leave us?
It means that we can't afford to give up. If there's anything EndSARS did, it showed us when we are united, we can make a lot of things happen. As long as we remain divided in terms of what we need as a people, then our attention will be distracted, as we are seeing with the ongoing challenges and disagreements in terms of how we should respond to mob justice in our country. There's no place for mob justice or jungle justice in Nigeria, and we should all be united in one voice about that. The other point which rightly you made is that we need political leaders who are courageous, who will stand on the side of rights and the side of justice. And as the people and civil society, we also need to constantly come together to drum this in their minds. You see, we've had some small wins, but now we're looking for the big wins, which is a transformative process. And for that to happen, people need to work together. Oftentimes, where they get us is distracted attention. So people are more interested in what is happening on religious lines. Some are more interested in what is happening on political lines, some ethnic lines. We need a recentering. We need to recenter ourselves on what our priorities are. And I tell you that they will listen. Otherwise, there's no reason why politicians should be going back to their constituency. There's this feeling that no matter what we do, the people, we still need to create this impression that we are loved by the people. And so that is what needs to shift. We need to the pressure needs to shift in a way that it is more favorable for office holders to do what the people want than for them to say, okay, it's just a matter of time, then they'll get tired and then they'll forget about it and we can continue business as usual. I think there's a lot of enlightenment now. A lot of people are, much more aware of what is going on in country. Technology has also facilitated this. And so we should now be thinking more about coordination, unity, one purpose in order to achieve our objectives.
Yeah, the one thing I've liked so far in this conversation, amongst other things, is the fact that when you highlight a challenge, you also suggest ways we can actually address it. And we're going to focus on that when we come back. I'd like you to explore more on personal safety. That's one major concern you highlighted during the start of this show. Surveillance, personal safety, and privacy. Oh, is the word privacy now? We'll go on a break. When we'll come back, that will be our focus on the last part of One Slot. So this is the last leg of the conversation. We've been talking about protecting those who protect human rights. And my guest has been the country director, Amnesty International, Nigeria. So back to the question of defenders themselves protecting themselves. You highlighted some of the areas of concern when we started. I want you to suggest ways. We'll continue to talk about how others can play a part in protecting defenders, but on the issue of surveillance, privacy, and you also talked about personal safety. How can they do it themselves? What are the little things that they can do?
All right, so let me start from behind. So on the issue of privacy, it's important for human rights defenders to separate their work and their advocacy from their private life. If possible, they should keep phone conversations with clients and other vulnerable groups in a separate phone so that they are able to shut down and they are able to, go about their work without too much interference. Also, basic habits that you have, not putting all your information out there on social media, just enough information, securing a lot of your personal data so that it does not get, it's not leaked online is essential. And this now comes to the issue about surveillance. Because technology is so accessible to all of us now, what happens is that quite a number of people have devices, but these devices have security profiles that you can have. Lock your phones, make sure you use strong passwords, be careful about phishing websites. So this happens when you receive links from people you don't know. Do not click on those links until you've verified who they are. And if you believe that you're being targeted by security agents or DSS, there are many groups like African, they call them defenders. Then there's also defender networks, frontline defenders who have toolkits about steps you can take in order to protect your device. Amnesty International also released a report on the Pegasus software and shared information about how people can check whether they've been targeted and what steps they can take to remove that. The other thing is also about your movement. It's important for human rights defenders to disclose to a trusted contact where they would be. Oftentimes when people disappear, it's because people don't even know where they are in the first place. So it's a lot harder for them to even acknowledge that they've disappeared. But if people know you're supposed to be back at a certain time and you're not, they can raise the alarm earlier. Then on the safety and security part, I always tell activists, especially, you need to be alive to do this work. You don't put yourself in danger in the name of trying to help someone or in trying to investigate a human rights case. Safety first. If the situation is dangerous, if someone is in a process of being harmed, you cannot just bring out your phone and start recording the scene. It means that you automatically expose yourself and then you can be arrested. We've had cases of people that have been beaten, people that have been locked up, people that have been accused, and even their devices were damaged because they were trying to capture a scene of a violation ongoing. We always say, check first if there's a secure way for you to do it. And if not, try to document as much as possible what is going on. It means that you have to rely sometimes on memory, but when you have the chance to then quickly write down a few things. But if you can be in a secluded place and are able to film or record, then you do so, but only if you are absolutely sure you're secured and people will not notice that you're doing that. The other is about your movement, like I said earlier, but in this case now it's about who you meet, about sharing information and letting people know. I know there was a time in Nigeria when you could get invitations from the police and they would say things like, oh, we're just inviting you over. You should never go to such meetings alone. You should always go with others. Others know you entered the station and they expect you to come out. And in many cases, if it involves, if you are sure, if you suspect foul play, it's also good to go with a lawyer. One of the things that have helped human rights defenders is to have a network of lawyers that you have access to and who you can call at short notice to say this is what's happening. Even if they can't be with you there and then, they know where you are and they can come and ask of you. But I always tell people, never go for those meetings or invitations with security agents alone. You should always go with more than one people, so they know that people know where you are and they can find you. And then finally, you need to take care of your health. That means you need to schedule time to rest, to sleep, to eat well, because it's only when you are acting optimally that you are able to withstand the stress, because it is a stressful role that you've taken on board, and you need to also take time to recharge your batteries and to look after yourself so that you can help even more people. I think the final note I would say is learn a lot more about security, about first aid, about what you need to do in an emergency, keeping emergency numbers in key places so that if something happens, people know who to call, who to reach out to, and more importantly, be a part of a community of people. Of course, many human rights defenders tend to work alone, but there are so many networks that exist that you can be a part of. They are not formal networks, but which in a way also means that if something happens, you have a group of people that immediately can mobilize action on your case.
All right. I mean, they have their work cut out for them already, so they have to take the extra steps to be safe. Still talking protection. Organizations like yours have done tremendously well when it comes to bringing out the issues, the violations, human rights violations, and those against defenders. What more do you think can be done by organizations like yours and others to draw further attention to the need to protect those who defend human rights?
Thanks for that question, because increasingly we see that many people are being targeted. And so one of the things that we are considering now is to have a constant monitoring of activities. So we ask human rights defenders to share with us what they're working on. So not necessarily all the details, but say, okay, I'm going to be somewhere and all these places. So it might not lead to anything, but it's important information to have. And then for those who have already gotten into trouble or who are fearful for their lives, there's a list of resources we have, depending on on whether you're a journalist. There are some resources that are specifically for journalists to provide them with some support. Sometimes it could mean a little contribution to addressing some of the legal charges they get faced sometimes, trumped up charges mostly. It could also mean getting somewhere safely where they can rest their head pending the time they decide their next steps. So while Amnesty International does not provide those services, there are groups that we know that exist that do, and we can link human rights defenders to them. The other thing that we are working on seriously is to create a sort of mitigation plan for human rights defenders, because prevention is better than cure. You know that you're going to make this intervention. You know the possible reactions. You're able to assess it early on. These are the possible reactions that could happen. Then you can put things in place to mitigate those risks from manifesting in that particular case. But the most important thing is information and sharing early enough about what you're doing. Because like I said earlier, once the authorities or security agents know that other people know where you are, and that your case has gotten the attention of international groups like ourselves or the UN, they, at the least, they're less likely to touch you. So if they've been torturing a defender, for example, the chances are that they will stop because they don't want you reporting all the things they've done. And at best, they will release you immediately. We've had cases of people that have been held for a long period of time, but ultimately they are released. The challenges we are seeing now is that increasingly legal charges are being brought against human rights defenders for crimes they know nothing about, and that they are being threatened, and their families are being threatened for the work they do. And that is why we say we now need to put pressure on the enabling law. Because if there's an enabling law, then it means that, because now the authorities in their mind feel we're not violating anything. But if there's an enabling law, it would also serve as a deterrence to the security agents and state operatives that it's not business as usual, and you cannot go about picking up people for doing their work for humanity.
Okay. I still have plenty of questions, but we're out of time. I will just chip this one in. We can't let you go without exploring your years of experience in human rights work. From all that you've gleaned over the years, do you think maybe there is a specific area that, if tackled, could be the, what's the word I'm looking for now, would be the answer, the beginning of the answer to ensuring that human rights protectors are protected? One key thing that comes to mind.
One key thing that comes to my mind is about transparency in our transactions. Oftentimes, the challenge is that people don't know where people stand on specific issues. And so if we can tackle that, then it means that we're one step to building trust and achieving our goals. I think that's a good way to sum it up.
Thank you very much, Osai Ojigho, for speaking with us and sharing your experience. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And happy Africa Day.
Yes,
to you.
It's tomorrow. Thank you again. In closing, here's a gentle reminder to all of us. All human beings are born equal in dignity and rights, regardless of where they come from, where they live, what they look like, who they love, what language they speak, their gender, their religion, or political beliefs, their social or economic status, or in whatever way they may be different from us. We are all equal. Let's treat each other fairly. Thank you very much for the gift of your time. I hope to see you next week. Until then, take good care of yourself. Bye for now.